everyone. Welcome to the show. My guest today is Olav Krigolson. So Olav and I got connected through a men's group that we join every single Monday. It's a place where guys from all over the world come to be able to share what's on their heart, what's real and alive for them. And I met Olav probably almost a year ago now. And, we only meet every Monday, so it's not like we're talking every single day. So I, slowly over time kind of got to know who he was and then ultimately understand what his core genius is and what he does for his work and all of that kind of stuff. And turned out he is a neuroscientist at the University of Victoria here in Canada. He's also highly sought after as a topic expert with regards to the neuroscience around how to improve our mental health and some of the things that we can be doing and the science that actually backs that up. And we spoke about that in this interview. And I think it was very timely in the context of what we're all experiencing in the world right now. There's obviously a lot of uneasiness, a lot of fear, a lot of anger, you would even say too. And just quite frankly, people are feeling off right now from everything from politics to our health, to our relationships, to the way that we interact with family. I know one of the things that I've heard recently and even experienced and have felt myself is this separation from, people closest to you, and where we number one, don't spend a lot of intimate time with each other, just face to face, let alone hugging or high-fiving or handshaking or kissing or whatever it is. But also just how it's creating division within families even. So some of the ideas and the beliefs and the biases that we all naturally have based on how we choose to see the world, how we were raised, our childhood traumas, our conditioning, all of these different things. It's such a fascinating subject. And I wanted to bring Olav on to just talk about his experience in that and some of the scientific research and the discoveries that he's found around not only why we choose, or not even choose, but why we show up and why we are the way that we are based on the science, but also what we can do to control that or to influence that, I guess is a better way to even put it. You hear a lot of people in this space that talk about rewiring your brain and how powerful that actually is for our overall health, not only our physical health, but especially our mental health. And why this is so important right now. So we went pretty deep on that topic, as well as, express some personal opinions even too around what we see all of this doing to the way that we all interact and some of the positive things that are coming out of this. I know we focus so much on the negativity and the restrictions and all of that kind of stuff, but what are the positive things that we can take from the stress that everybody is feeling right now? And I think you're really going to enjoy hearing from Olav. He's got an interesting perspective. He speaks from the heart. He speaks his truth. And he's somebody that I just really appreciate having in my life. And I can't wait to introduce him to you. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. And here we are. Olav, so good to see you, my friend. Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I would have given a bit of an intro prior to this that you wouldn't have heard yet, obviously, because I haven't even recorded it. But I always kind of introduce how I know people and what the context is of this conversation. But I was really looking forward to chatting with you because as I've got to know you over the last, almost a year now, I would say, being a part of the Monday night calls that we participate in, I've got to actually know you on a very personal level, but then also understand kind of what you do in your professional life and where your background is at and all of that. And it's just been more and more relevant and top of mind for me, the whole idea around mental health and our mind and how we react to certain situations. And naturally, I go down deep rabbit holes of exploration and curiosity to try and figure all this stuff out. And some of it just quite frankly, it's it's a lot. It's a lot, right? But I was really excited when you spoke up last week talking about you being interviewed on different topics related to this, specifically with what's going on in the world right now from a neuroscience perspective, because of course you are a neuroscientist working at the University of Victoria. And yeah, I'd love for you actually to just give a brief introduction as to who you are, what you do, and then we'll just kind of roll from there. If you want to just introduce yourself to everybody.
Of course, Trevor. Like Trevor said, my name is Olav Krigolson. I am a neuroscientist at the University of Victoria. What that really means is I spend most of my time doing research. I think I've found a lot of people think professors spend a lot of their time teaching. I actually don't teach that much. I'm a research scientist who teaches occasionally. And throughout the COVID pandemic, a lot of what we study is how people brains adapt to different situations. And COVID has almost been a global experiment in a sense, which I've found fascinating, just watching how people have changed throughout the course of the pandemic. And just, when I look at some of the things that are occurring in the world, to me, I can think about what's going on in the brain and how that sort of explains behavior, if you will. One of the big things I try to do with my day job is I'm really interested about neuroscience in the real world. So like a lot of research is lab based, and people wonder, how does this actually, impact me or translate to me? So my lab spent a lot of time trying to study these phenomena out and about, to try to, see if the theories that we develop in a lab hold up in the real world.
Well, and I was taking a look at your podcast, which is that Neuroscience Guy. For anybody that wants to go check it out as well, I'll make sure to link it up. But there was two that really jumped out that you've done in the last few months, even too. So how your brain reacts to being sick, and then the Neuroscience of Fear, which is kind of tied to all of this stuff we're talking about. And, those are two of the major topics I think I wanted to lean into, because to give a little context for everybody listening, because I think I've mentioned it to you already, Olav, but, a couple of weeks ago, I did a solo recording, 2 solo recordings actually, speaking out loud about how concerning everything is in the world and the mandates. And just from a personal story perspective, as a dad, and I know you're a dad as well, I made the choice to not get vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And I totally respect everybody else's opinion too. This isn't a vaccine conversation, but I've been restricted from taking my kids to swimming lessons. And naturally, I can't go on a flight or do anything for that matter, really, And that was one piece of it. But then the other piece was just shifting the conversation towards mental health and questioning, are we measuring the right things? And how is this actually impacting suicide rates in the world? And, what is there science behind a hug and a smile? And what comes up for you when I say all that? Because that's what I've been saying out loud. And then naturally it has me go, well, what's the answer to all of these things? And I'm sure you have a perspective that would be super helpful on that.
Well, the science and hug one, the hug piece is kind of really interesting, because one of the COVID phenomena that I've found fascinating is, it used to be you'd go to, a supermarket, right? You'd be standing in line and you would there's people in front of you and behind you, and you don't really interact, right? You're on your phone, or you're just sort of waiting. And I've found that people talk more now. Like, we're kind of starved for communication and interaction in a sense, because, whatever stage the pandemic has been in, it's still not normal life. So I've found myself having these random conversations with strangers, right? Just, and extended conversations. So it's similar to the hug idea in the sense that, like, we're hardwired to be social creatures. We like social interaction. There is a small subset of the population that isn't wired that way, but it's a very small percentage. Like, it's pretty rare you find someone that doesn't want to hug. And in this pandemic situation, it's pretty rare you find someone that doesn't want to interact. Like, we do it with different degrees of germophobia, I guess. Sometimes when I'm out for my morning walk, you see some people do this massive loop around you, and other people are still a lot closer. But even on the morning walk, I find, like, it used to be we would just sort of look at each other, and now it's like people say, "Hey, how's it going?" And I think it's one of the things you see is that we're all kind of starved in some sense for more social interaction and interaction, and that ties to that mental health thing that you brought up, which is, most of the decisions that have been made within the pandemic are completely medically based. Whether they're accurate decisions or not, that's a whole other debate. But I think people haven't thought about I think they've thought about it, but the focus hasn't been on mental health, clearly. And I've got a couple of friends that are clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists, and they're just like, the amount of calls that they're getting and visits that are all depression or suicide, or they're skyrocketing. And it's gonna, and the thing is, people think the pandemic's gonna end and this stuff will just be fixed. That's not the way it works. It's like, if you look at soldiers that come back from wars, they're messed up for years. Like the impact of COVID's gonna, for every month we've been in it, we've probably got 2 months of time to recover. So we're looking at probably 4 years, and that's just a guess. But, it's definitely not going to be like, oh, the pandemic's over, everything's good now, let's all be happy.
Yeah, no doubt. I thought of two things when you were explaining that. One is, I think of Howie Mandel all the time because he was kind of well known as like being a germaphobe, right? He'd never shake hands. He was always fist bumping and that kind of thing. And I know even personally, because it's, we can look at the world from our observation, from our own viewpoint, through our biases and everything else. But like for me, we'd have a guy come over here to help fix the sprinklers. And do you shake hands or don't you? Like you start thinking about it. And then eventually you just kind of default to not doing it. And then it just starts to feel like normal again, but in a way that doesn't feel right. And that's kind of what's come up for me in the last 2 years. And it's been gradual. It's not like it happened overnight that all of a sudden everybody just stopped shaking hands or smiling. That's one thing. And then the second thing too is the fact that we're hearing a lot of politicians, and I don't want to tie in all the politics on this, although I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it, but hearing politicians that are speaking up, but they're actually doing it again from the perspective of what they're experiencing. So they're saying their constituents are calling in, and they'll make reference to like the mom that's saying that their kid won't eat because they're so anxiety filled from what they're dealing with at schools and the lack of interaction with their peers. There's seniors that are calling in and saying that they want to end their life because they're so lonely. They don't have people around them, including loved ones. And then the other reference was, a man that called in who was a small business owner who was in tears because his business is collapsing in front of him. And I'm, although it's really sad to hear those things, I'm really encouraged to hear people talking about this out loud because it's at least bringing awareness to it. And, that's the first thing that came to mind there is how slowly things kind of got to where they were. And then now, how do we get back to a state of wanting to interact and be social and hug and smile and high five and everything in between?
There's a lot of interesting pieces in there. Like as a dad, and I know you're a dad too, the kids thing is one thing that you mentioned that I've thought about a lot, right? So from a neuroscience perspective, kids' brains are still developing, right? And they don't have all the tools that you need to deal with things. So I'm really curious about the impact on the kids. Because while, my son's more tech savvy than I am, at least it looks that way, it's not the same as direct interaction. And he is socially isolated now. Like he does go to school and he wears his mask, but his actual friend time is really, really limited. And he definitely experienced paranoia. And it's that no reference point, right? Like they're new to the world. Even we look at them and they're 14 and 15, we think, oh, okay, that's pretty far along. Your brain's not finished developing then, right? Like your brain is, and especially the logical part of the brain, so that's the front part of your brain, what we call the prefrontal cortex, that's the last thing to finish off, right? And it's basically why kids make stupid decisions, because the logical part of their brain isn't there fully yet.
Yeah.
And it's why girls actually mature a little bit earlier than boys, because the prefrontal cortex in girls tends to be a little bit more fully formed. And they have these emotional systems there. And the other one that was interesting is the elderly people, because like I said earlier, our brains are hardwired to be social. And, elderly people can be isolated at the best of times. And then you slap a pandemic on top of that, right? And it's in the data on this is really clear. Like if you look at elderly people that do have a lot of social interaction, these are the ones that are high function, high performing. They have lives. They get out. They do things. And the ones that tend to, slip into Alzheimer's or dementia faster or end up killing themselves are the ones that are socially isolated. And that was without the pandemic. Like that was just the way it was pre-pandemic. So then you add the pandemic on top of it, where you're pushing more of them, or all of them in some cases, into social isolation. We're just creating all those problems that we already knew that were there, but we're just pushing more people there. And it's sad. Like my mom's in New Zealand, and I haven't seen her for 2 years, and she doesn't have a lot of friends there anymore because she's 84, and a lot of them have passed. And she's in tears most nights when I call her because she's just so fed up. She doesn't know what to do. And I think the only reason she's still, keeping going is because she believes at some point her son and her grandson will make an appearance. And it all makes sense in terms of the brain. Like it's just the way we're wired. I think part of it's just being aware of it too.
Totally. Yeah.
You're not to feel bad because you're down. It's perfect. Like, people that are up, people that are depressed or a bit more sad during the pandemic, like, yes, you should be. Because if you were going to design a system to create depression, COVID is what you would design. Like, you take people away from their loved ones, create these impossible situations like yours where you can't go see your kids, but you're dying to go see your kids do their sports. And that's the recipe for what you would do.
Yeah, no, and I believe that just having conversations like this to even just bring awareness, even if it's just one or two little nuggets along the way that somebody picks up, is a part of it. And, one of the byproducts that I actually experienced of doing those 2 episodes, which, to be perfectly honest, was uncomfortable for me because I had my own fear of like, well, what if I say something that offends somebody? What if my facial expressions and my hand movements make me look like an angry 14-year-old Trevor that used to fight when I was a hockey player? I had all these things coming up in my head, and there's probably, I'm sure you could break down exactly why that is too. But when I did it, and I actually stepped through that, and I did it from the intention of like just having the conversation, I actually reached out to family even too, including my sister, who's a principal at a school with an MBA with 23 years experience teaching. And I was like, how are you doing? Because I'm seeing articles talking about like what's actually going on in the schools and the pressures that the teachers and the administration staff are feeling. And she said, I haven't cried as much as I have in the last 6 months, is what she told me. But then also just thanks for asking was the immediate response after that.
I think society gives us this pressure to not share our emotions as much as we do, right? We live in a lot of superficial conversations, and this is kind of goes back to the supermarket thing, which was pre-COVID. Oh, how's your day going? And this default response is good. Very rarely would you give the honest response was, well, actually, it's going really crappy.
Here's the truth.
Here's the truth, and just even that connection, just to reach out and do it. Because I'm as guilty as anyone else, even though I know that these things are real. Like I phone my friends and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And we have this very sort of high level conversation. And then you hang up and go, well, hey, I've talked to someone, but did you really talk? And again, that's part of that innate need we have for social interaction. And it's also part of it's innate to share it. Like, one of the key steps with these things that, and I'm not a clinical psychology type, but what the research shows you is one of the worst things you can do is keep it all in, right? Like you want to get it out somehow, whether it's a conversation or a journal or however you express yourself. And the reason for that is your brain needs to release on it. If you ruminate on depression, the cycle of depression, for instance, is just basically your brain is in a loop and it can't get out of it. So, any depression intervention, and that, it comes down from stuff in the midbrain that's firing weird and lots of other things. But the key to treating that is to somehow get out of that loop. And sharing is one way to do that, right? It's communicating.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm just thinking like even something as simple as this, gratitude, 1 line a day. Like I bought this one at the bookstore a few weeks back. Yeah, and I've got another journal that I use as well, but this one was really simple to do. I was like, yeah, I can do that. And it is actually very gratifying to even just get something out, especially when it's from a positive perspective. But I think this is like you and I meeting where we have inside of this safe container for men to be able to just show up and speak what's real and alive for them. It's a piece of that. And I think it's becoming more and more evident, at least I'm feeling in the last like 2-3 months, that how much need there is for these spaces for people to just be able to come and talk and be seen and be heard. And to find that commonality in that tribe, kind of like you talk about with the seniors, like if they're locked up in their rooms, well, that's not good. But what was their life like before? Well, it was, go for lunch, play some cards. Like it wasn't super exciting maybe before, but there was that interaction, right? There was the ability to be seen and be heard.
Yeah, exactly. And we all, well, I think the the Monday night thing is really interesting because one of the anecdotal comments you hear a lot is the weeks that we show up, we have good weeks afterwards because we've had this experience of talking, and the weeks we don't have as good weeks. And I think that is, it's just from a social science perspective, highlights just the value of these conversations. And what you said about the seniors is equally fascinating, because one of the problems with this is, like, basically what we do is at the left side of our brain, the frontal part sort of constructs a worldview, and this is our reality. This is what we deal with. So whether it's going for lunch and playing cards as a senior, and the right side of the brain is sort of questioning that worldview constantly, saying, is this the way the world works? And one of the things that stressed us is that COVID has forced us to constantly update our worldview. Like, it's the seesaw of these surges of COVID, right? Everything's okay. Like, this year is a classic example, which is, I think, almost unanimously, we all had a lot of hope heading into Christmas and going, oh my God, it's going to be a normal Christmas. Can't wait. Or whatever your winter holiday is, right? And then all of a sudden it gets shattered again, right?
Yeah.
And our brain's struggling with that because it's, most of our lives are pretty constant. Even if you're someone that travels all the time for work, that's still a constant because you're just used to doing that all the time. And the pandemic has forced us to just constantly be in this state where our worldview is just constantly changing. And those swings are hard. And you parallel that with, the emotional center of our brain is something called the amygdala. There's two of them, one on the left, one on the right. And, our emotional system is on overdrive right now. We're in a stressful situation, which ramps it up, and it's not just, it's constant stress. Like, it's just like whether even if you're handling it well, there's constant stress because in the background, there's the pandemic always, right? Which is no different than being in a war. I keep using that analogy because it's true. Like, being in a war, it would be constantly stressful. And we just haven't had a real break. Like, even the breaks haven't been great. Like, during the summertime was a little bit better for a while. But in the back of our minds, we're all going, well, when's it coming again? And the news is always suggesting that something's coming and it's not quite done yet. And so you combine all these factors, it explains a lot of behavior.
Yeah. I've got a couple other things I want to go down, but you just brought up one that I'm going to latch onto right now, which is the media message. And just from that scientific perspective, if you want to speak to, and even any kind of personal opinions you have, but the best way to describe it is that if we prepare for war and challenge and struggle and financial strain, then we get more of that. And if we prepare for a world that's like peaceful and loving and filled full of abundance, well, then we get more of that. At least that's a theory, right? And maybe it can be scientifically backed, or maybe it's just a spiritual belief. But the media, what part has the media played in this? And what's your thoughts on that with regards to, like, what if we led the news with more good stories as opposed to the death and the despair?
Yeah, I think it all depends on what, a lot of the channels tend to start with doom and gloom, right?
What bleed leads, right? What bleeds leads. Yeah,
exactly. And that sets the tone, right? And it's, we believe that's the truth of our world, right? We all have our own news sources, right? Some of us, watch different channels or read different things because that's what we believe is true. But whatever you're reading doesn't really matter. It sets the tone. We've sort of been raised to go to the news as a source of truth, right? And if that message is negative, that puts us in a negative space because we believe the world isn't as good as we hoped it would be. And you're right. If the message was more positive, that puts us in a better space. And, I think that, I don't know what it's like in Kelowna. Vancouver Island Television does a pretty good job of trying to balance it. At least it's not always, like, I always contrasted it. I've got a lot of friends in the States, and I just know every time I'm down in the States, it's amazing how different the tone of the news is. Like, it's just constant stories about crime and whatever else and political crises and COVID. And I think in Canada, we do a better job. Well, I'm not saying the media up here is perfect, but it seems to be better. And I'd be curious to see how that impacts differences in beliefs about the world. Like, I know there's a lot of psychological data on this that, Americans believe they're more likely to have their home broken into, and they're more likely, to be murdered, even though you can actually show that if you compare demographics with a comparable part, say, of Canada, statistically they're not. It's not going to happen. But it's just the media sets this tone, and it does have an impact on us because it's one of our big sources of truth in the world. So if you think back to the prefrontal cortex, the right side of the brain is integrating all this all the time, saying, "Well, this is the way the world works. So the world is a bad place. That's how we have to see it."
Yeah, there's almost a rewiring that needs to happen on that too. What's obviously you're familiar with the Dr. Joe Dispenzas and Bruce Lipton and all that kind of stuff too. And that's a lot of the language that they use of like rewiring your thoughts that ultimately helps change your entire perspective. And even I don't want to mispronounce this, but like the neurology of your body, your chemical makeup of your body. Do you have?
Well, it's exactly true. It's one of the key neurotransmitters in this is dopamine, and dopamine is associated with reward and pleasure. And it's pretty clear that if you have a more positive worldview, you've got more of this neurotransmitter floating around, and this leads you to feeling better. So that the idea of rewiring and focusing on different things is massive. I remember one study where they actually took the news out of people's lives, and they were happier, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like the curse of social media. Social media can be an amazingly good thing. It can also be amazingly negative, right? So it comes down to this ability to being able to do it. And that's why one of the things I've focused on a lot is brain health throughout the pandemic, because, one of the best things you can do is put yourself in a place where your brain is as healthy as possible. And the analog is obvious. Like if you were going to run a marathon, say, you would train and put your body in a place to be successful. Well, it's true of your brain. There's things you can do to put your brain in a better spot to be successful, and that allows you to cope better, whatever whatever aspect of the pandemic you're talking about.
Yeah, and I know you were kind of joking about it last week, saying that I got interviewed on, and I think you referenced a few sources of like 5 tips for better brain health, and kind of referenced the idea of like they weren't that like earth shattering. It's pretty basic stuff, but let's repeat these though, because people, I think a lot of times, maybe with everything that's going on in the world, might just think like, oh, how do I change my perspective in this world? How do I feel better in my own skin and my own head and that type of thing? What were those 5 things that you talked about? Let's just say them out loud for people so they can ground for them, wire something into people's heads.
Well, the data from our lab, it's a project that I've had a lot of passion on recently. Data from my lab and other labs too is quite conclusive that sleep is like the number one thing that impacts mental health. If you are getting a good night's sleep, in most people need between 7 and 9 hours. There is a small subset of people that need less than 7 hours. But one of my favorite studies is they found all these people that said they could live off of 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and they were all underperforming. There was like 3% of them or something that were able to actually function that way. The rest of them just thought they could.
Right. Yeah. They willed themselves to it. They hustled their way to it.
Or, how many cups of coffee do you need to get going? And ready to go. But so sleep is the number one thing. Like getting a good night's sleep is a priority. And there's all sorts of sleep tips that are out there, that you can learn to help have a better night's sleep. The other 2 are kind of, like I always say, it's the stuff our parents told us, because it's diet and exercise. We all know that alcohol sales have gone up during the pandemic quite massively, but it's actually the worst thing you can do in a stressful time. So we do it because we believe that if we have a couple drinks, it's going to make us feel better and we'll relax and chill. But, it's the data on alcohol. And to be honest, I'm not a Puritan here. I enjoy a couple beers as much as the next guy. But, alcohol is a depressant. So if you're in a depressing situation and you're taking depressants, it's just, it's a short-term fix with long-term consequences. And just diet too. There's a lot of research now that high sugar diets are bad for your mental health. The new Canada Food Guide is actually pretty impressive in the sense that, they've hit it pretty good, which it's not what we were raised with. It's definitely changed from the food guide I saw as a kid.
I'm going to have to link that up, because I don't think I've maybe even looked at it for 20 years.
Yeah, just about, I think it was a year. I don't remember exactly. It was in the last year or 2. They released a new food guide, and it's basically stuff you see in the media, which is you probably eat less red meat and less processed meat, and eat more vegetables, less carbohydrates. So it's in line, and the research supports it. And the last one's exercise. whatever your form of exercise is. For me, it's a daily walk. Exercise is good for brain health. So those three things are sort of the classics. The two newer ones that people talk about are things you can do in terms of mindfulness. So, a lot of people think of meditation right away, but it doesn't have to be meditation. It could be yoga. It could be breathing. It could just be sitting in your backyard, in a quiet space, but just stuff that allows your brain to sort of calm down and have a bit of time off. So mindfulness and all these forms of mindfulness have been shown to have positive impacts on brain health. And then the last one's social interaction, which of course we've already touched on a bit. But if you do those 5 things, in principle, that's like how you're training for the Brain Olympics. And if your brain is in a healthier spot, you're better able to deal with things like the pandemic. Again, there's so many cool studies that can be done, but I suspect strongly that people that are doing more of these things are probably reporting less rates of depression and suicide. And people that are ticking all the boxes, there was a stretch early in the pandemic where just some personal stuff happened in my life. And I was not ticking all 5 of the boxes. And I can assure you my mental health was not where I wanted it to be. And as I've sort of, regained these 5 things in my life, my mental health is in a better space.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important thing to say out loud too, is that, a lot of times I know I just started a program, a 12-week program, actually. I invested in it. And I'm like, I'm all in, and it's health and fitness and mindset and breath work and everything related. And I'm wired myself personally to go, okay, I'm going to do this right. And which means I'm going to get all my baseline. So I got the list here. I'm going to go get my gut health, micronutrients tested, my blood cells, my vitamin levels, my body fat test. And before I knew it, I had 20 things. And it was just oh God, when am I going to have time to do this? So I actually grounded back to just working on one thing at a time. So having an intention and then a behavior that then becomes a habit and kind of the path to becoming a new person. And the silence thing and mindfulness has been a big one for me because I do a cold plunge every single day now, Olav.
I know, you were telling us about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I bought a horse trough and put it on my deck. And luckily here in Canada, it's cold enough, but I've been going in it and actually using it as a journaling thing too. So I'm making a commitment. I go in it every day and then I speak to my camera and just record myself and journal. And I had a friend the other day challenge me. He goes, all right, I'm going to push you on something here. He says, why don't you sit in there and do nothing? I was like, what do you mean do nothing? Why would I not do something while I'm in there? If I'm going to be sitting in a cold plunge. He's like, no. Trust me on this. Just do nothing. And I just started last night with the intention on doing that. And I found my mind just racing. I had 50 things go through my head before I finally caught myself and stopped and just said, just breathe. So I'm just saying that, be kind to yourself, right? As you start these practices.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's the big thing to realize is if you walked away from listening to this saying you were going to try to tackle all 5 of these things in one go, you're bound to fail, right? Our brains, as you mentioned, it's true. When we're rewiring habits, one step at a time, right? You've got to give your time for your brain to learn something new. So you pick one thing and you do that, and then you tackle something else. And also realize you can't do it all the time, right? It's not like you should, some nights you will get less sleep for whatever the reason is, right? Sometimes you are going to break your dietary habits. Sometimes you'll forget to go for your walk. That's fine. It's developing the trend over time. And the other thing you mentioned that I always found fascinating, something I've gotten into in the last year, is breathing. I find breathing an amazing, that would be my form of mindfulness, is just trying some deep breathing exercises. And I find it's once you learn how to do it, in a sense, I find it really relaxing, and I come out of it quite focused and chill, if that makes sense. Part of me is ready to tackle what's next. Part of me is very calm about it. I don't know if I'm brave enough to leap into the cold tub, though. We got. I live in a place called Cab Rovay, and there's every morning when I walk along the beach, there's a couple people in the ocean sitting there doing the morning plunge, and I always think to myself, I can see myself doing it, and then I sort of forget that I said that.
Well, there's no doubt about it that it's massively uncomfortable naturally, right? It's just on your skin, your body, your blood kind of goes to your organs, and you want to freak out a little bit in the first 30 seconds because your body's just kind of adapting. But that's the one thing that it took me about I'd say a dozen times of doing it to really get into a state of just accepting the fact that like, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. And then when I jump in here, it's going to be uncomfortable until my body starts to kind of numb, but then I can relax. And I find that's, it's very therapeutic too. So it's even less about the like benefits of the cold therapy side of things and more about just how I'm facing this challenge that quite frankly, you know, I'm not going to die going into my cold plunge, but so then why am I creating this story of how painful it's going to be? It's actually not that painful. I'm just telling myself that. And that's been really interesting psychologically, and even the breath work too. It's a very similar thing, you know. I've found myself at times, you know, for example, if I'm engaging in what could be a heated conversation, healthy conflict, right? Like not an angry situation, but healthy conflict. I feel the pressure in my chest, and then I actually notice that I stop breathing. And I wasn't really conscious about that before I started doing some breath work where, you know, you notice it and then you're like, wait a second, I'm not breathing. So therefore there's no oxygen getting into my blood. My brain's not engaging. And, you know, it's huge. You need to breathe.
You do. One thing that you said that I found fascinating, because I've experienced this myself, is people have to remember that perception is learned. This is kind of a side note, but like we learn, like you can learn to adapt to these situations, right? Because we learn to perceive these things. Like the people that live up in the north, like, you know, the Eskimos or whoever, you know, they can live at different cold temperatures because they've adapted and their bodies have learned that that's perfectly fine. And you know, it's so you can't adapt to all of these things. You just gotta give it some time and let your mind make the change.
Right. What's just curious if you have an answer on this, but what is kind of the timeline that somebody can expect to create a habit? Because you hear all different kinds of perspectives on this. Do you got any insights on that, on what the data has told you?
There's no magic number for it, because it's the biggest problem is individual differences, right? But generally, you know, you need to keep it something for a couple of months. You know, I'd say that's a rule of thumb. You definitely can't expect to form a new habit in a week, right? Like it's something that has to be reinforced. So a lot of it's how you form the habit, right? Which is you've got to reward yourself for doing the habitful behavior, whatever that reward is. You've got to make it a priority in your life, all right? Goal setting is a big thing. Reminders about your habit, because your brain cues on these things, right? You know, when I was trying to cut back on sugar, I put a sign on the fridge that said, "Don't eat sugar," right? And it was enough.
I gotta get that one. I gotta make that one, I should say. You don't have to buy it. Just go get a piece of paper, right?
That's all I did. But it was funny how that one little cue helped me with the habit, right? Because before that, I would go to the fridge and grab something sweet, or the drawer, because, you know, it's just in the kitchen so I can see it. And, you know, I was justifying it in my brain, and I was going through the whole thing. And the worst part was, given my day job, I knew exactly what I was doing. Like, you're lying to yourself to break the habit, right? But generally, it's a couple months for something to settle down. It's just the individual differences are tricky. But again, it comes down to things as well, like you know, mindset, where your mental health is. Like one of the problems with the pandemic is creating new habits in a stressful environment, or an emotional environment is trickier than if everything is going, you know, great. It's also why we break habits, you know. You know, we talked about alcohol sales. I bet you ice cream sales are through the roof during the pandemic too, right?
Yeah. Or even nicotine too, for that matter, right? They say
for sure.
Those are the recession-proof kind of industries, right? Because whether it's an up or a down market, everybody seems to default to the alcohol, either celebrating or in a depressive mode.
Exactly. So yeah, a couple months is sort of the rule of thumb, but the more important thing is not sitting there waiting for a couple months, but the things you can do to set yourself up. So reminders, good brain health, rewarding yourself for doing the habit. Yeah.
We've got a sticker, like a magnet on our fridge that says, "You're not hungry. You're thirsty. Drink some water." And it's like right by the fridge door. I know, right?
Hydration's one that I need to get back into, because I know that the data on hydration, again, like the funny thing about it, all the data is clear. It's just a matter of doing these things, right? Like if you drink your recommended amount of water per day, your brain will function more optimally. You'll be less tired. It's just remembering, I had 3 sips of water this morning, and then what am I at 4 hours later, and I've yet to have another sip because I just need to remind myself.
Well, again, that's why it's good that we just talk about this, though, because, there's lots of conversations out there about these things, but a lot of times it's the simplest things that can ground a person into better mental health, just starting with something as simple as drinking more water,
Exactly. Well, if I was going to push one above all, and I sort of mentioned this is a passion area for me, but we've done the research on it, sleep, and like just good sleep hygiene, right? So the classics are like, no caffeine after, midday ideally, but definitely not after dinner. The research on screens in front of your face is conclusive, I would say, which is, the refresh rate of an iPad does increase alertness in your brain, creating a positive sleep environment. And in fact, that's scary. I've got a friend down in the States, Matt Walker, and he's a big sleep researcher. And he said the scariest thing to me that I've ever heard in my life a couple of years ago when I'm striving to get there, which is the best way to assess your sleep quality is you should be going to sleep the same time every night, regardless of whether it's a weekend or a weekday. But here's the scary part. You should be able to wake up the same time every day without an alarm clock and without feeling the need for caffeine. And he said, if you can pull that off, your sleep hygiene is good. You're good to go. I've got to the part where I don't need an alarm clock most of the time, but I'm struggling with the caffeine piece. I'm not going to lie.
Well, part of this program that I'm in right now, actually, I've been, texting back and forth with the fitness trainer that I'm involved with and just trying to get my head wrapped around everything so it doesn't become overwhelming, but I can set a routine. And it's intentionally meant to be like intermittent fasting, which I think is another piece of the sleeping side of things too, because if you start eating at like 11 and you finish at 5, well, now your body is not trying to process food at, from that snack at 10 p.m. at night. So I think that's a piece of it. But then the other one was coffee. I was like, I don't know what your opinion is on coffee. And he's like, no, keep drinking your coffee. But, throughout this program, you will stop drinking coffee. And I was like, what? How do I stop drinking coffee and function in the morning?
Yeah.
So I'm literally in the middle of that one.
I'm even worse off than you because I don't drink coffee. So I'm one of these weirdos that's having Diet Pepsi at 9 a.m. to get their day going, which is completely disgusting at any number of levels. But I sort of ebb and flow. I was pretty good without caffeine for September to December. And then I did the COVID thing in December, and then I got pneumonia afterwards. So for the past sort of 5 or 6 weeks, I've had no energy. And I found that the Costco run to get the flat of Diet Pepsi was the only way to really get through the morning.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we both have patterns that we get to shift somehow here, right? I don't know what the answer is. It's but we'll figure it out. I'll keep you posted on what I sort out there too. But one other thing I wanted to touch on with you too, and you kind of brought it up, the idea of this sickness and just sickness in general, but especially with COVID and the fact that, I think everybody that I know now has got it, or at least knows somebody that has. My whole family, our kids didn't get it actually officially. We didn't test them, but my wife did. I had all the symptoms, but tested negative. Both my neighbors were positive, and they were here the night before that we all got sick. Like it's literally everybody's getting it. But I sent you over a handful of things before this too, and I just wanted to touch on some of these topics. Like,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, the idea of like anxiety contagion, where we make something worse due to the anxiety of what it could be. And then questioning like how many people would be in hospitals right now if we didn't have this overlying fear that's surrounding COVID and the in your face every day about the death rates and everything. And so I'm interested to get your perspective on that. And I'm sure some of it may be personal opinion, but others, if you want to maybe, yeah.
Oh, no. The science on the anxiety and stress piece is clear, which is anxiety and stress both. It sounds weird that there's a link, but you can go on Google Scholar and read about it yourself. Anxiety and stress weaken our immune systems, right? So by creating the state of anxiety, we're actually putting people in a place where they're more likely to get sick. And the other thing that happens is of course, there's the placebo effect, which in this case would be the reverse placebo effect, which is if you're anxious, any symptom you have, could be amplified, right? So something that you normally would just go, okay, I got a cough. Now it's like, do I have COVID? And that, can psychologically make things worse, right? Our brain is definitely, one thing people always, people won't forget because maybe they've never heard it, but our brain creates the world, right? Like, our the world that we see and interact with, it's created by your brain, and anxiety plays a role in that. And if your anxiety is creating this world where you think you're sick, it could amplify that even more. So you can literally think yourself into getting sick. And the double whammy is if you do get sick, anxiety and stress can weaken your immune system. So, you're in this weird place where you're sort of hitting yourself twice, if you will.
Yeah, it's such an interesting and complicated subject too, because I know, like, for example, I have a cousin who's an EMT and he's surrounded by death all the time, right? He's constantly bringing people, seniors in many cases, from nursing homes into hospitals and ICUs and whatnots. And that whole fear around the sickness and dying and death is obviously something that a lot of times is really, like, people don't like to talk about it. And then therefore that creates anxiety. And then when I think about the doctors, because I know one of the things, and I've had to work through this in the last couple of weeks, even in speaking out loud about, like, here's what's real for me, knowing that it's not the only story, because he has his perspective too. But as the trucker rally, for example, has been going on, and people are either behind it or indifferent or against it, in some cases, like in my cousin's case, he's been vocal about the fact that, like, I don't agree with this. And part of his grounding is that we need to continue to support these healthcare workers because they're still in the trenches doing all this stuff. And I agree with him, but I think it's both though. And then that's where it gets a little complicated. And then the one other thing I'll say, and I'll let you respond, is I think about these doctors too. Like our doctor, for example, our general practitioner, he's stressed right now. He doesn't say it out loud, but you can tell, like, he's like, yeah, my staff can take time off, and in fact now get 5 days paid leave as per government mandates, but I can't take any time off. And we brought him a care package the other day with some wine and a Starbucks gift card, and we were just like, appreciate you. That was it. Just trying to give him a little glimmer of, like, appreciation. And yeah, I don't even know where I'm going with that, aside from to say that, like, it's such a complicated conversation that I think a lot of times people are led by the fear or influenced by the fear, and then therefore anger takes over, or wanting to be right, and as opposed to the compassion side of things, of seeing that, like, of course we want all of our doctors and healthcare workers to be supported throughout all of this, and we want our freedom of rights back. What comes up for you when I say that? There wasn't really a question in there, but
yeah, no. It touches home a bit, because we did a fatigue study in the ER pre-COVID here at one of the hospitals, and the doctors were all exhausted, right? It was very clear from measuring their brain activity that they were exhausted. So if they were exhausted and stressed before the pandemic, think of what they're like, because they're just people. They have a job and they suffer all the things we do. So the thing that's scary about it too is, exhaustion and stress and anxiety, decreases your ability to make good decisions. So again, if you wanted an interesting research project, I'd be fascinated to look at the number of medical errors that have been made during COVID versus before COVID, because we're putting our doctors in a place where they're worn out, they're tired, they're constantly stressed. Their exposure, like it's kind of like, every time you walk into a hospital, your chances of getting sick is much greater now than it used to be. So I think that I love the compassion thing for the medical people, because from a personal anecdotal experience, it would be easy to get frustrated with the medical system because there's delays. It's slow. Where you want things now and you can't. Like my doctor told me to get some blood work done a while back, and it took me 4 weeks to get into life labs.
I was going to say, how many months did that take? Yeah,
I know, and it's like by the time I got the blood work, like what's the point? Like it's easy to get frustrated, but I think the other side of it is the stress and fatigue that these people are feeling is probably greater than our own. Just because they're exposed. We can hide at home. They can't. They're going right to where they know. Like they're going. Like every time you go to the grocery store, all of us probably go, well, wonder if anyone here has COVID. They go to work in a place where they know there's COVID. It's all over the place. Well,
and it kind of alludes to what you were saying before of like going to war in a from a mind perspective, it's kind of like that. It's just we don't call it that, but they're in the trenches every single day. Yeah, I think it brings up, and we won't have time to go down this hole here, but just looking at and analyzing the right things. I know that's one of the things that just keeps coming up for me is, so how many errors are happening in the medical space because of the stress related to all of these things? And then at the same time is, well, how well funded are these things? Like in Canada, of course, we have like a healthcare system where our taxes pay for that. And naturally, our wait times are a little longer for certain procedures as a result of that. And then you go into the States where it's like pay for service and their disaster of a Medicare system and everything else, right? And neither one is perfect. But I believe that there's aspects of like, I just think about where funding goes from a political standpoint and where we decide to put our money. And part of me, like when my cousin says like support the doctors and the nurses and they're understaffed, is like, absolutely. And let's encourage more people to go to nursing school and to go to medical school. Like, let's change this now. So in 20 years, we have a completely shifted perspective on like preventative medicine and investment in things that will actually make the world a better place and less anxiety filled.
Even
personal opinion.
No, but I can give you some anecdotal data. Even optimizing the medical system. I was listening to a talk last year, and it was from a young medical doctor from Vancouver, someone I met and got to know a bit, and he gave a talk, so I wanted to listen to it. And one of the things he said that startled me more than anything is in a 12-hour shift, he spends 10 hours doing paperwork and 2 hours with patients. And it's like, that's horrible. Like he should be spending, 11 and a half hours with patients, and someone else should be doing the administrative stuff that's not what he did all the training for. He did all the training to be in front of patients. And in terms of the demand on the healthcare system, I couldn't agree more. Like when we presented our data about the fatigue in the emergency room here, the doctors completely said, well, yeah, we are all tired, but the problem is we need 20. There's 16 doctors that handle the emergency room at the local hospital. And they said, we need 24.
Wow.
Right. But it's a budget area. It's a budget issue, right? Doctors, society has made doctors expensive. So for Island Health to come up with money for 8 more doctors is not a trivial thing. And I agree with you. I would love to see the budget breakdown for some of this stuff, because I have a suspicion there's a lot of money being wasted in a lot of places.
Yeah. Well, and it even translates into the private sector too, because you think of, like, I have many friends actually that I grew up with and went to university with and stuff that ended up going into pharmaceutical sales because it was just so lucrative. Like, I'm talking early 2000s, right? Like, you could be right out of university and pop into a job and be making $150,000 at the age of 28. Like, who doesn't want that job, right?
Exactly.
And naturally, back then, there was this, like, they called it no free lunch when they finally brought in the rules of like, hey, you can't take a doctor golfing as a means to get them to prescribe your drug. Like, that used to be a thing, like as little as 20 years ago, which is insane to think. But even medical sales too. I just think, like, I wonder if people actually understand the cost of a medical bed. Like, it's expensive. Does it need to be? I don't know. Could it be supplemented through government funding?
There's got to be a better way to do it. That's for sure.
There's got to be a better way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I know that I don't know as much about the hospital purchasing, but I can give you a classic example. I don't. Well, maybe I'll get in trouble from this. Who cares?
Well, we can cut it if it's risky. Let me know.
No, it's not risky at all. But I bought $1,000 TV for the lab to put on the wall. Right? Reasonable TV. We use it for presentations and things. It serves. It's not a recreational device. It's used for science. And the university charged me $1,000 to wall mount it, and I wasn't allowed to do it myself because that would violate some kind of rule, right? And it's like it doesn't cost $1,000 to wall mount a TV. Like, give me a break. And so the question I've always asked is, where does that money go? So if it's happening in universities, it's happening in hospitals, right?
Yeah.
They were going to repaint my lab, and the painting bill was like $23,000 or something. And it's like, it doesn't cost $23,000 to paint a couple of rooms. Come off it. Where does the money go? So if it's happening there, it's going to be happening it's going to be happening in hospitals and any aspect of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and that's the deep question to ask on all of this stuff is, are we asking the right questions and analyzing the right things? And I think, if anything, though, the call it chaos of what's gone on in the last 2 years with the pandemic and everything else is at least bringing to surface these conversations where people are asking the right questions, or they're starting to. And I think that's important.
I agree 100%. I think, just focusing on what we said about the healthcare system, I don't think we ever questioned it before because it was never really like, we all knew someone that was occasionally in the hospital and someone occasionally got really sick, but it's not like this thing now where it's like all of us care, right? Like we're all watching the number of ICU beds and the number of people in hospital because we've been told, and it's true based on what happened in Italy in the early days of the pandemic in Spain, if those numbers had gone too high, things would have been really bad. But, I think it's the first time most of us have really thought about where the money goes and how it really operates.
No doubt. All right. Well, I'm very conscious of time here, Olav, and I want to end us on one important question here before I let you go. What is one thing you are most grateful for right now?
My son. It's always my default answer, but I've got an amazing 14-year-old boy who I see almost every day. And he actually did his science fair project the other day, and he was using a portable brainwave device to measure brain waves. And he did his own neuroscience experiment. And I as a dad, was just sitting there. I taught him how to do it, but he did all the work himself. Dad, it would be easy to think that Dad lent in and gave a hand, but I told him up front, if you want to do this, but it was his idea. So I just, to know my son loves me and he's a part of my life, that's definitely what I'm most grateful for.
Right on. Well, I figured we'd end on that because that'll wire our brains to put smiles on our faces here for the rest of the day. So I appreciate you doing this with me.
Not a problem, Trevor.
I appreciate the insight that you had to share and even your personal opinions and whatnot as well. I think it's an important piece of the conversation for people to, give this a listen and just consider how they have the ability to create some impact on how they think and how it can impact their lives. So how can people learn more about you? How can they check out and find your podcast as well?
Yeah. So I've got a Twitter feed, That Neuroscience Guy, where I sort of post updates about the science my lab is doing and things we do. The podcast is That Neuroscience Guy. It's on Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you want to look. It's the neuroscience of daily life. So it's not really about my research program, but like our first episode's on the neuroscience of impulse shopping. So why you might impulse shop, and just a range of topics about trying to explain things in our daily lives and how what's the science behind it. And then if people are curious about the research I do, it's my last name, krigolsonlab.com. If you can't spell that, it's tricky, but I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. So There you go.
Perfect. I'll link it all up. And yeah, I appreciate your insight and also just appreciate having you in my life, man. Like I enjoy seeing your face on those calls on Monday nights. So,
thanks for having me. And it's great I'm happy we've become friends. It's the Monday nights are definitely one of the high points of my life.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll see you in a few days then.
You will see me in a few days for sure.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Trevor Turnbull Show. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please consider subscribing on my YouTube channel and on your favorite podcast platform and leave me a review. I'd love to hear from you. Now, until next time, remember, today is a beautiful day of opportunity. Trust that you're exactly where you're supposed to be right now. So be grateful, be curious, and be brave.